Thank you. Is this on? Okay, so I'm recording and everybody can hear me? Thank you so much. That's quite the honor to be compared to Ken. Okay, something's a little too loud there. Yeah, let's do that because we're going to get feedback. This one I don't know how to turn off. Ah. All right. So thank you all for being here. I was reflecting before I came that this is the fourth time that I've given this Sunday message. And each time I've focused it around a holiday or a set of holidays. The first time I was here was in September, and the Jewish holidays of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur were upon us, and we talked about atonement. Then I was here in early December, and I focused on Pearl Harbor Day, now supplanted in our collective unconscious by 9/11. And we talked about attack and defense. Then I was here in the spring, talked about Easter, Passover, freedom, resurrection. So here in February, I thought, we're right in between Groundhog Day and Valentine's Day. And no, they don't have quite the stature of Easter or Yom Kippur. But I thought, let me take a look at it and see if I can have some fun with it. And as anyone who's read my book, From Plagues to Miracles, knows, I'm very fond of metaphor, parable, kind of looking at a story and finding that deeper strand of meaning that speaks to us. So, I figured, what the heck? And just as with From Plagues to Miracles, where I thought I had this cool idea about Exodus, and I figured it would be about a 50-page book that people could put in their bathrooms, and it turned into something much, much bigger. I found, as I delved into Groundhog Day and Valentine's Day, that there was way more there than I ever expected. So I will probably either blabber on well past the time that I'm allotted, or I'll just cut it short. And at some point, I'll have to write a book or a chapter on a book about it, and then we'll get the full thing. So, Groundhog Day, interesting holiday. Been around since around, well, actually, I wrote it down. 1887 was the first Groundhog Day celebration, where they got Punxsutawney Phil out, and everyone here should know the way it goes. If he sees his shadow, he gets frightened and he goes back into hibernation, and winter is at least 6 weeks prolonged. On the other hand, if Punxsutawney Phil does not see his shadow, he stays out, he's a happy little groundhog, and spring is right around the corner. So there are 5 elements here. We've got the groundhog, and I'm going to say the groundhog is us, just as in Exodus the Hebrews are us. We've got hibernation or sleep. We've got sun, shadow, and we've got the coming of spring. The key element here, the one that determines everything that happens seemingly, is the shadow. So what is a shadow? I asked myself. Let's think about a shadow. Well, a shadow is a thing of darkness, but it's insubstantial. You can't grab a shadow. You can't hold a shadow. It's unreal. It's two-dimensional, so it slides over three-dimensional reality, but it really never becomes part of three-dimensional reality. What makes a shadow? This gets even cooler. Well, a shadow has to have a light source, and it has to have something that obstructs that light source. And when that light source is obstructed, we get a shadow. So this set me thinking about, spring as kind of enlightenment, the promised land, what we're all trying to get to. The sunlight as the light of God, the groundhog as us, and the shadow, well, that's, as I said, where it gets interesting. What is the shadow? So if the groundhog comes out and sees his shadow, something must have taken place that we don't think about. Imagine you're standing there, sun's beaming. If you're looking at the sun, you don't see a shadow. You only see your shadow when you turn away from the sun and go, woo, there it is. So if the groundhog sees his or her shadow, I don't know what gender Punxsutawney Phil is, and I'm not going to look. um, but if the groundhog sees its shadow, it's turned away from the light. And if we turn away from the light and behold the shadow, it's for sure that we have delayed the onset of spring. We're going to be waiting a little bit more because we're perceiving darkness instead of light. So the first lesson I extract from Groundhog Day is, oh, look at the light, turn toward the light. When we look at the light, we see no shadows. However, this is not an easy thing to do. In From Plagues to Miracles, I shared my own mystical experience in my early 20s that was truly amazing, and I think certainly solidified the path that I've been on, but blew my socks off and probably set me back about 10 years in my meditation practice, because every time I would sit and get quiet, I was expecting that same complete dissolution in God and light and love, and I was terrified that it might actually happen. So turning directly to the light, there are those among us who can do that, but I don't think that's the common path. I think in general, when we turn to the light, we go, ooh, too bright, and we turn around, and then we see the darkness of our shadow, and we're delayed. As A Course in Miracles says, I found a bunch of neat quotes I'll share today. A darkened mind cannot live in the light, and it must seek a place of darkness where it can believe it is where it is not. So the groundhog returns to dreaming. It believes it is where it is not. It really belongs in the light. We all belong in the light. But there's another way to understand shadow, and that's, as a psychiatrist and a psychotherapist, I can't overlook it, and that's Carl Jung's idea of the shadow, which is an aspect of the self that comprises all of the disowned and disavowed elements of who we are. When you go to your boss's cocktail party and you smile at everyone and you say hello, you are hiding your shadow from everyone. On the other hand, when you're with your family and it's a really crappy day and you're in the car and you hit a traffic jam, and your shadow probably comes out in spades. So all of those aspects of self, the anger, the hate, the guilt, the sense of sacrifice. Do you kids know what I've done for you? All of that, all of that is shadow. And Jung made the point that we can't be complete and integrated beings without acknowledging that shadow and bringing it into the light. And I think this is what's important. Not necessarily to dispel it. I think that's sort of the last phase, but to work it. If you don't know it's there, or worse still, if you know it's there, but you're doing this little pretend act of, no, I don't see that. I'm this really good guy, and I never get mad, and I'm never a pain in the butt. Then you can't work on it, and shadow will continue, I would argue, to show up, because that which we try to suppress, kind of like a game of whack-a-mole, has this funny way of turning up somewhere else in our lives. So when the groundhog sees his shadow, he isn't capable of going, oh, there's my shadow. Those are all the dark, disowned aspects of myself. I guess I'd better work on it. He's just a furry little mammal. He goes back into hiding. But we can do better. We can do better. A Course in Miracles says, you must look upon your illusions and not keep them hidden. At another place it says, the Holy Spirit asks of you but this: bring to him every secret you have locked away from him. Open every door to him, and bid him enter the darkness and lighten it away. He brings the light to darkness if you make the darkness open to him. But what you hide, he cannot look upon. What you hide, he cannot look upon. So as long as we're not able to orient towards pure light, as long as we have these things called bodies and personalities and families and jobs, we serve ourselves well, not just to try to work on it ourselves. This is where I think Course in Miracles, parts ways with Jung, but to simply open it up with awareness, with recognition, turn it over to that higher power, as 12-step programs would put it, turn it over to Holy Spirit, and Holy Spirit will do the job. This is where miracles comes in. When you let go of what you think it should be or what you think it was based on the past, all of a sudden you get that miracle that shows you with the shift of perception that there is another way. Now, in the purest sense, coming back to that sort of that end stage of shadow work, if we remove the obstruction, there is no shadow. Those of you who know the Course well know that the introduction says, that, this is the Course doesn't teach the meaning of love for that beyond what can be taught. That the goal of the Course is to remove the obstacles to our awareness of love's presence. Love is here all the time. Again, it's like the sun. On a cloudy day, the sun isn't gone. It's just behind clouds. Well, in our minds, we erect those clouds. The light of God is always there. It's always within us. But since as selves we identify with a physical body, and here's what I love this one. If we can remove the body, then we stand in the light without a shadow. If we remove the body. Now, obviously, that doesn't mean you should go out and commit suicide. I'm certainly not advocating that. But it means when you take your attention from the physical body and all that it represents and its survival needs, its getting mechanisms, its gluttony for pleasure and its avoidance of pain, and yet somehow it seems to wind up giving us pain. When we overlook that to the light within and overlook that to the light within all of our brothers, then we stand in the light, recognizing light with no shadow. But Groundhog Day has this other end to it, this other element. And that is, if Punxsutawney Phil comes out on a cloudy day, he doesn't see his shadow, and he stays out, and spring is coming. Okay, that's kind of a paradox. Why, if he doesn't see his shadow, is spring coming even faster? Well, we do know if he sees his shadow, he goes into hiding. My experience with my mystical union, it didn't allow me to get there more quickly. It was frightening at some level, and I wasn't completely ready for it. In Exodus, I talk about this in From Plagues to Miracles. I talk about this in Exodus as the experience of the Hebrew people at Mount Sinai. They've been given all of these miracles. They've escaped from Egypt. They've crossed the Red Sea. They've had manna in the wilderness and water from the rock. But they get to the mountain of God, and they really aren't prepared the way Moses is. So where Moses saw a burning bush that intrigued him and said, turn aside from your life in the world and come explore this, the Hebrews see this horrible, fearful, smoking, smoldering, clashing, clamoring, volcanic deity from which they have to turn away. And what results is not 6 more weeks of winter, but 40 years of wandering in the wilderness. I would suggest they are, in fact, one and the same thing. So the groundhog is out there with this diffuse light. There's no clear source. It's not too bright. It doesn't see its shadow. It's not afraid. And it stays out there. I think this is the reality for most of humankind. As I said earlier, the sun is still there, and it's pretty much guaranteed to come out at some point. Maybe in a few hours the clouds break, and Punxsutawney would have seen his shadow, but he didn't. He feels safe. Again, to quote A Course in Miracles, light cannot enter darkness when a mind believes in darkness and will not let it go. One of my favorite quotes from the Course, one of about 1,000. Eyes become used to darkness, and the light of brilliant day seems painful to the eyes grown long accustomed to the dim effects perceived at twilight or on a cloudy day. And they turn away from sunlight and the clarity it brings to what they look upon. Dimness seems better, easier to see and better recognized. Somehow the vague and more obscure seems easier to look upon, less painful to the eyes than what is wholly clear and unambiguous. So like the groundhog, most of us prefer clouds. But how does this then get us to an early spring? Well, I think it's more obvious than it seems, and that is we can't learn through fear. We cannot learn through fear. And the Course makes clear that Holy Spirit will never allow anything to take place that would cause fear, because that will delay us. Truth cannot come where it could only be perceived with fear. Or another one of my favorites, fear not that you will be abruptly lifted up and hurled into reality. You don't have to stare at that sun. Time is kind, and if you use it on behalf of reality, it will keep gentle pace with you in your transition. So even if we're there not beholding the light on most days, saving it for Sunday mornings, if we are willing to stay present and clearly look upon the winter world within which we live, where the light appears to be dim, our eyes will begin to adjust. We'll develop a greater tolerance for seeing light and for recognizing it where before we didn't know it existed. So the beauty of Groundhog Day, just like A Course in Miracles, they're really very close, is that no matter what the path, spring is coming. You're not going to stop it. Maybe it's 6 weeks, maybe it's even longer than 6 weeks. I always used to get to, mid-late March and go, what the heck? Okay, the groundhog saw a shadow, but it's been 6 weeks. Where's spring? Spring is coming. Whether you can, in a sense, embrace light and be it, or whether you do that shadow work in a very conscious way, or whether you simply persist and commit to your path, even though you don't see light that much, spring is coming. For those of you who might be fans of the George Martin series Game of Thrones, they're always saying winter is coming. No, that's the fantasy world. Spring is coming. And spring is the time of awakening. Now, Groundhog Day has been given a whole nother set of meaning, however, in the last 20 years by virtue of the absolutely marvelous movie Groundhog Day with Bill Murray and Andie MacDowell. And I think this is relevant because when we ask, well, gosh, we're in this winter world, how long is it going to take for spring? I think the movie Groundhog Day answers how long it can take to get to spring. Has anyone not seen this movie? Okay. Basically, Bill Murray is in Punxsutawney for Groundhog Day, and you should just watch the movie. It's an amazing movie. So for all the rest of us who have seen it, he has to relive this day over and over and over. And initially, his goals are false goals. He wants to sleep with Andie MacDowell, and because he's living the same day over, he gets better and better at learning, oh, that's what she likes, and this is how I should respond here. And his ego mind tries to game the system and get to what he thinks is happiness through control, manipulation, deceit, his clever mind. And there's a sequence in the movie that I absolutely love where after you see him, sitting with her and he's like, oh, yeah, I was a major in something in college. Oh, really? Me too. Each scene ends with her smacking his face. And they get to a place where it's just smack, 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 smack. This would be equivalent to the line in the Course that says, tolerance for pain may be high, but it is not without limit. Eventually, everyone realizes, however dimly, that there must be a better way. Smack, smack, smack. So Bill Murray turns around and gets very, very depressed. When his ego goals don't take place, he has no sense of meaning, and he now tries to kill himself over and over and over again, only to discover that each time he kills himself in multiple different ways, He wakes up to, and put your little hand in mine. There ain't no mountain you can't climb, babe. I got you, babe. And he has to go through the same thing again and again and again. It's an incredible little model for reincarnation, for the idea that you are eternal and you're going to learn the lesson. As the Course says, you don't get to choose the curriculum, only the time that you want to take it. And gradually, realizing he can't die, he sees that someone else dies. Like the Buddha, he confronts death and illness and aging, and decides that he wants to be compassionate towards these. And in doing this, he starts helping people and discovering love. And by the end of the movie, of course, he wins the love of the woman he wanted, not because he's trying, but because he's just exuding so much love that she can't resist him. So that's how we do it. That's how we live in the shadows and get there. That's how Bill Murray did it. The one flaw in the movie is that it sets up romantic love and getting the girl or getting the guy as sort of the end-all and be-all. And that's where we segue to Valentine's Day. Because Valentine's Day is all about focusing on someone out there who you love or who you would like to love you, and sort of signaling to them that's the case and hoping they respond in kind. The origin of Valentine's Day, apparently, and I looked this up on Google, so I'm sure it's true, is the Lupercalia in Rome, which was a 2 or 3 day festival where men would get drunk and naked, sounds like a college frat party, and they'd sacrifice a goat and a dog, and then they'd take the hides of these animals and they would beat and whip women with them, and the women would stand in line waiting to be beaten with the hides of these animals, believing that this was going to somehow enhance their ability to be fertile. And then they went into a matchmaking ceremony, where they draw lots and go off and pair with whoever they drew lots with. And this is how we celebrated in Rome, I guess, the first rites of spring. I think it might also be where the expression "knocked up" came from. Fortunately, today we have Hallmark flowers and chocolate, a lot better than dog and goat hides. But there is this exaltation of romantic love that, if you're a fan of romantic comedies, and I must confess I am, we do see romantic love as the top of the mountain. If we can have one person love us in that incredibly special way, then we've made it. We'll be talking about this in the workshop to some extent, because clearly, as anyone who's been married for any length of time knows, that is an illusion. Throughout literature, romantic love has, despite romantic comedies, been looked at as an intoxicated state, a false state. Shakespeare in A Midsummer Night's Dream, the characters are given the love potion, and immediately they fall in love with someone completely different than who they loved at the beginning. The fairy queen Titania has, the essence of this flower dropped on her eyelids, and she proceeds to fall in love with the first thing she sees, which is the very poor theatrical player Bottom, who's been given the head of a donkey, of an ass, and she thinks he's the most beautiful thing. So in a sense, Shakespeare's saying love makes, asses of us all and makes us fall in love with asses. And who hasn't done that at some point? But where I see the connection between Valentine's Day and Groundhog Day is in the Greek myth that of Cupid and Psyche, or Eros and Psyche, if we're going to go with the Roman. So Valentine's Day, is all about Cupid, who shoots these arrows, and whoever gets struck by an arrow falls in love, very much like the love potion. And this comes from the rich Greek Roman tradition, and in that tradition, nobody is immune to Cupid's arrows. I mean, Zeus himself, the mightiest of the gods on Olympus, had been struck by Cupid's arrows and gone off and fallen in love, although he was prone to that anyway, with all kinds of women and beings. The story of Eros and Psyche, though, is very interesting, especially when we realize that Psyche is also the word for the mind. You know, it's kind of like they're underlining it in red and going, parable here, pay attention. This is about the mind and the mind's relationship to love. And the story goes, because I'm sure, unlike Groundhog Day, many of us do not know the tale of Eros and Psyche, that Psyche was the youngest daughter of a king, and she was beautiful, she was innocent, she was poised, she was really pretty perfect. In fact, she was so perfect that nobody wanted, that she was worshipped but never wooed. Her older sisters got married, but, how do you get in the presence of a goddess and make that a relationship? Another problem with romantic love, as we'll see. She also incurred the wrath of Aphrodite, Venus, the goddess of love, because, you don't look as good or behave as lovingly or get worshipped the way the goddess of love was worshipped and not incur her wrath. So Venus, or Aphrodite, sets it up that her son, Eros, Cupid, is going to shoot Psyche with an arrow on her way to a place where the oracle has told her she is to marry death. So the mind is engaged to death. Don't need to explain that one, I don't think. That's where we're headed. And on the way, Cupid is supposed to shoot her, so she falls in love with death. And there are people we've seen who've probably been hit with that arrow. Movie Harold and Maude comes to mind. But Cupid pricks himself with his own arrow, sees Psyche, falls in love with her, and decides to rescue her from death, takes her to a little paradise, a little bower of his own making, visits her there every night where they lie together in perfect bliss, but he warns her, whatever else you do, you cannot look upon me. Don't look. It's like God saying to Adam and Eve, whatever you do, don't eat that tree. And we know, eat of that tree. And we know what happens when we get those warnings. And so sure enough, Psyche starts getting visited by her sisters, who are not the nicest people. They're kind of like evil stepsisters. And they go, how do you even know who you're with? He's probably this horrible monster. You're not going to know until you look at him. So Psyche takes a knife and she takes a candle and she hides them, and she resolves that she's going to light the candle and cut off the head of the monster when she sees what it is. And of course, she lights the candle and she beholds the most beautiful being that she can imagine there. But a drop of wax from the candle falls on Eros, Cupid's shoulder. He wakes up, sees her, says, you just blew it, and he's gone. He's gone. What is this telling us? Back to shadow work, it's sort of saying that our ideal of romantic love, and I would argue that any addictive solution to the avoidance of death, it could be romantic love, which I think is the second most common addiction in our society, workaholism being the first, but it could be, the substance of choice, whatever you're inclined to do, that anything that we use in that way can only thrive in the dark. Back to the groundhog, back to that quote from the Course about our eyes preferring dimness. And yet, we can't survive, we can't sustain that. We won't allow it, because as beings of light, we have to move towards light. We have to know, we have to look. Again, we don't get to establish the curriculum. We don't get to establish the curriculum. We only get to choose when we want to take it. So when Psyche lights that candle, she's entered a journey that she hadn't been on before, a journey of discovery. And what she discovers is that where she thought there would be a monster, there was actually a god. Now, we can get into all the psychological implications if you want to go Jungian on it, and there's some lovely stuff there about what it takes to be in relationship. A Jungian writer by the name of Robert Johnson wrote a series of books called He, She, and We, and the book She looks at the myth of Eros and Psyche. But I think as spiritual seekers, what the tale is telling us is that the two polarities of, oh my God, I love you, you are so special, and oh my devil, I hate you, you are the worst person in the world, and I'm going to cut your head off and slay you, are both just extreme elements of illusion which must be pulled out of the dark, looked at in the light, and worked on. And the whole second part of the tale of Psyche leaves Cupid out of the picture, and she's given 4 different tasks by Venus, by Aphrodite, by the goddess of love, that are impossible tasks, but she's determined to solve them, and each one gets help. They're kind of, each one is a little Rumpelstiltskin sort of a tale where, somebody shows up to, some animal shows up to help her. And at the end, she has done her inner work, and now she is worthy of becoming a god, and she and Cupid Eros do get together, but as gods in the light. And I think that this outlines the transition from what A Course in Miracles calls the special relationship, which can only thrive in darkness, and which is an addictive way of avoiding death, but actually, you're stuck with that being of love who's also a monster in your mind, or who's going to become that monster when all of the projections that you put on him or her are gone. But once we choose to look, once we choose to come out of the light, come out of the darkness and look at the light, we're launched on a path that will eventually allow us to recognize the God, capital G, in our brothers and sisters, and in so doing recognize that that is also in us. So, in closing, perhaps Cupid's arrows on Groundhog Day are not just about random falling in love or going out and killing goats and dogs and beating women with them. And what if Cupid's arrows are actually those shafts of light coming from the oneness, the Godhead, that are piercing us at every moment and allowing us, spurring us, driving us inevitably to awaken? Because I think they are. So whether you're the groundhog, whether we identify with Psyche and her awakening task, the light is there. The light is waking us up. Let's embrace it. Thank you. Now I forget, what's the order here? Do I go right into the meditation?